So, according to Zakia's brother Yunus, the missionaries at the hospital had forced her to convert to Christianity. She wrote to Yunus to come take her home, but when he arrived at the hospital, the missionaries wouldn't let him in. They feared that if Yunus took her, she'd be returned to Islam. Yunus wrote to British authorities to plead for intervention, explaining he had contacted the local police, but they couldn't help him because the hospital was protected by the capitulations. In the missionaries' view, Zakia had converted at her own free will and had no interest in leaving the hospital. Her brother Yunus was only making a fuss at the product of local so-called troublemakers, whom I'll return to in a moment. What we know for sure is that Yunus opened a case at the local Sharia court. And as the hearing date approached, local residents complained about this, quote, attack, in the Islamic religion, end quote, which caused moral injury and offense. And I'm going to return to this Arabic word, khan, in a minute. Egyptian parliamentarians urged the judge to protect Islam and religion broadly against what they deemed a violation of Article 13 of the Constitution, and especially public order and general morals. Invoking ideas of religious unity, indicative of nationalist memories of 1919, Prime Minister Mahjoub Thabit, for instance, argued that, quote, it is necessary that the missionaries know that Egypt's Muslims, Christians, and Jews are but different birds on the same tree. They live in perfect harmony and do not take at all to that which may violate the public order, end quote. Concluding his remarks with hope that such incidents would not repeat themselves, Thabit received applause from the chamber. For their part, the missionaries recognized that the case was before the Sharia court, but argued that Zakia had a constitutional right to religious freedom, meaning freedom to convert, that should override any Sharia principles now and in the future. Again, so this is an attempt to privilege the secular law over the religious law, right? In hopes of winning souls. Because potential converts in cases like Zakia's were usually young women, this argumentation meant saving women from Egypt's majority religion, Islam, gendered masculine, in conflation with the women's male relatives, their male public supporters, and Egyptian sovereignty. The judge ultimately ordered Zakia to be rejoined with her family. The missionaries were, of course, outraged, but their attention turned to the troublemakers I mentioned earlier. In response to Zakia's case, local Muslim notables began organizing to disrupt the missionaries' activities. And these notables would soon become early adherents of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded soon after in the nearby city of Ismailia by Hassan al-Banna. So this shows how cases like Zakia's, of which there were many others, contributed to the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood. The second incident involved an American Protestant missionary of Dutch descent, Samuel Zwemmer, the so-called apostle to Islam, who founded and edited the missionary journal, The Muslim World, which happens to still exist, to still be in publication. In 1928, Zwemmer entered Cairo's Al-Azhar Mosque with a small group of visitors and distributed a missionary pamphlet. The pamphlet was titled Return to the Old Qibla, and Qibla, as most of you know, refers to the direction of prayer indicated by a wall niche in a mosque. And it described Muhammad's decision to redirect prayer from Jerusalem to Mecca, which Zwemmer saw as an antagonistic break with Judaism and Christianity. It invited Muslims to return to the so-called original Qibla of Jerusalem and to seek Christ. And to facilitate this, Zwemmer advocated for religious freedom across the Islamic world as the right to leave Islam. And he saw it as his right to exercise his speech, no matter the setting, to win souls. On this occasion, though, a sheikh in Al-Azhar Mosque and his entourage confronted Zwemmer, and a stir ensued. 3,000 Azhar students soon initiated a strike, and protests spread to the Parliament building in Cairo, where the incident was debated. One minister asked indignantly, quote, "Did you hear what the American missionary did, igniting the fire of discord all over the country? how he dared insult Muslims and wound their honor by attacking Islam, and in the largest and most holy Islamic institution, end quote. In reply, the Interior Minister claimed that the government was taking steps to protect religion in ways that satisfied the Egyptian people's, quote, desire for public order, end quote. I'd like to suggest that this missionary local divide, there was a missionary local interpretive divide here over religious freedom that hinged on different sensibilities around seduction. And what I mean by seduction is not the limited kind of sexual sense of the word that's familiar to us today, but rather a broader notion of, rooted in Latin, meaning to divert one from one's path or one's truth. So to seduce can mean leading someone from his or her truth. And this Latin understanding of seduction is very different from modern liberal version of the word, which is associated with adept persuasion, consent, and choice. In the liberal societies from which missionaries hailed, seduction is valued positively, especially in the marketplace, as a sign of individual freedom, because it seemed to involve reasoned choice, right? Think about advertising. By contrast, coercion is illegal because rather than consent, it involves compulsion through the threat of or actual harm to another's property, including the body. And in Islamic theology, seduction has been viewed as dangerous to both the individual, who can be led astray, and to the social order, which can descend into chaos. Right? So whereas missionaries tied seduction to free will, choice, and consent, Egyptians tied it to coercion, which was viewed as dangerous. And we can see this quite clearly in a political cartoon from 1933 in the Egyptian journal El-Kashkul, where the missionaries are depicted as forcibly converting Egyptians through the use of alcohol, magic spells, and confinement here of children. Right? And so the seduction that's portrayed here in caricature, attempts at conversion, were widely viewed as an attack, on the collective body from which protection was required. Right? Again, this gets us to the question of protection of religion. So tan is one of several words in the Islamic textual tradition connected to Islamic ideas of blasphemy, whose purpose was less to stifle certain acts top down than to protect the community by encouraging benefit and discouraging wrong. And this vocabulary often refers to a verbal or physical attack that induces psychological and physical pain. And I see their use in Egypt as expressive of a kind of moral injury, or the degrading of individual or communal standing. Not in the law, but in terms of one's moral being, value, and dignity. But by the late 1920s, this moral language around blasphemy was increasingly being linked to modern law, and especially public order. We saw this in both Zakia's incident and the Zwemmer affair, but it's also clear in a case involving the Egyptian intellectual Taha Hussein. In 1926, jurists from Al-Azhar famously called for Hussein to be charged with blasphemy for his recent book, Fashar al-Jahili, on pre-Islamic poetry, which historicized the Islamic textual tradition. And they argued that Hussein had, quote, seriously denied the Quran and attacked the Prophet and his noble lineage, and in so doing incited the fury of the pious and perpetrated what violates public order. Legal action against this attack on the state religion is requested. So Hussein's presumed violation of the moral code was now a violation of public order or general morals. It was a violation of modern law, and it required punishment. Parliament soon debated whether Taha Hussein should be charged in court. Those who supported punitive action against him argued that he was disseminating ideas that invite error and iniquity, seduction, especially among the nation's youth, because Hussein's role at the time, he was Dean of Cairo University. So in other words, consistent with the classical law in Islam, they took issue less with Hussein's convictions than with the effects of their expression. But the investigative prosecutor, whom parliament assigned to the case ended up relieving him of trial based on a more secular presumption of intent, right? The idea was that Hussein didn't intend to attack religion, but he was pursuing a new kind of empirical research that was becoming increasingly common in Egypt. But it's also clear that even had the prosecutor wanted to charge Hussein, there was as yet no law in the books for him to do so. The culmination of the genealogy of religious freedom I've been laying out is the introduction of such a law. And this development paralleled Egyptian sovereignty. In 1937, Egypt signed the Montreux Convention, dismantling the capitulations over a period of 12 years. And as part of this convention, it made proselytization by missionary institutions illegal. So this was essentially the end of mission in Egypt, even though it took 12 years for the capitulations to be phased out. During that same year, 1937, the Egyptian government issued a new penal code in which Article 161 declared offending religion a punishable crime and authorized the state to determine what constituted an offense. In my research, I found many cases showing how this article was applied. For instance, in 1939, Protestant converted Coptic missionary Hakim Wasif, like Samuel Zwemer before him, was distributing Christian material, though on the streets of Cairo rather than in a mosque, and allegorical stories rather than disputatious pamphlets. One of these stories, titled La Fleur de la Forêt, the flower of the forest, described a female prostitute saved by Christianity. The publication caused a stir in Egypt because many understood the protagonist's name, Fatima Zahra, to refer to the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima az-Zahra. Coincidence? I think not. The implication seemed to be that Islam led women to licentiousness from which Christianity would offer salvation. Unlike Zwemer, who was a protected foreigner, Wasif, a local subject, was swiftly arrested. And unlike the Zwemer incident, which inspired protest and debate, the stir sparked by Wasif's actions was quickly contained. Wasif was sentenced to 1 year in prison with labor based on Article 161 of the Egyptian Penal Code. The court said that by distributing this book, he had desecrated Islam through the figure of Fatima, again the daughter of the Prophet, and spread falsities about the religion because the book allegedly misquoted the Quran. So cases like Wasif's led the state to consider further legal measures for regulating quotidian interactions between Egyptians of different religions, showing how religious freedom, rather than resolving religious difference as a problem, actually created new religious divisions. To recap then, the contingent translation of the concept of religious freedom in Egypt, a process that began after 1919 and was heavily shaped by Protestant missionaries, led Egyptians to articulate a notion of religious freedom as protection of religion. This notion was linked to a local moral vocabulary around blasphemy that had long historical pedigree, right, with the word tam. But after a series of local crises in the 1920s, the Egyptian state entered protection of religion into the law, transforming a moral issue into a modern legal one. And what I was surprised to discover as I looked further into Article 161 is that it was this article that soon after former Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat was assassinated by an Islamist militant in 1981, was slightly revised to introduce Izdirar, a deen, the charge that so dominates Egyptian public consciousness today. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers, and particularly for putting me on a panel with two of my favorite people in the field. This may not be to everyone's liking after some of the conversation we had this morning, but fire at me. Okay, so in a front-page story on Armistice Day, 1921, the editor-in-chief of Al-Ahram, Dawood Barakat, wrote a fiery op-ed in which he asserted that for the first time, only 3 days earlier, the words minority and majority, aqaliyya, akthariyya, had been uttered for the first time in Egypt's history and now threatened to destroy the peaceable relations between Muslims and Copts that were the hard-won achievement of the 1919 revolution. Just as the Spanish influenza was ravaging the bodies of millions, Barakat warned that the term minority, like a conceptual bacteria, had infected, care of a number of unnamed political scientists and European politicians, the already diseased body of the Ottoman Empire, hoping to effect its final disintegration. The Arabic word for minority, aqaliyya, was a dangerous microbe, Barakat contended, and it had already spread contagion in previously tolerant communities of Syrians, Armenians, and Turks, but Egypt alone had resisted this violent disease. According to Barakat, it wasn't just the germ of the concept that was new to Egypt, but the word itself. So while Barakat's pathogenic metaphor has slipped from memory, his basic contention that 1919 represented the apogee of Muslim-Christian ecumenical relations that resisted foreign conceptual contaminations has deeply persisted. In history writing on Egypt, statements abound as to when was the first moment the word minority and its associated package of rights was uttered, as if, once unleashed, it would forever contaminate a once sterile country. The scholar Seteneh Shami locates the first usage of minority, much like Barakat, in the early 1920s in the constitutional debates, while Saba Mahmoud recently tells us that Coptic activists in 1919, quote, refused to accept the assignation minority on the grounds that they were no different from their fellow Egyptians, end quote. So like Dawood Barakat, these authors share a conviction that the introduction of the term minority was modern, colonial, foreign, and that it both reflected and was itself the cause of a change in communal relations. They posit that from its birth, the minority rights discourse was entangled with European imperial objectives to divide and rule. The introduction of minority in the secular conception of rights upon which it depended, they contend, far from mitigating religious difference and securing religious freedoms, instead exacerbated them in sometimes horrifying ways. Yet claims to the novelty of minority by contemporary historians and nationalist intellectuals alike are deceptive. Egyptians used the word aqaliyya as a way of numerically conceptualizing the relationship between the country's Muslim and non-Muslim inhabitants long before minority first appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1918, and long before its usage exploded globally among international lawyers after World War I. So far from a primordially European idea dating to Westphalia, as Saba Mahmoud tells us, the term minority, as we now understand it, seems to have burst on the global stage in the 1870s from a fittingly marginal origin in Manitoba, in Canada, when a debate between Protestants and Catholics over education funding and language learning reached a crisis known as the Manitoba Schools Crisis. Previously, and for much of the 19th century, the term minority had either referred to the stage in the human life cycle, an understanding that was often metaphorically extended to the colonized children of major paternal empires, or else it was used to refer to numerically weak groups in a strictly parliamentary or representative sense. Minority takes on its current sense in Egypt right at the same time as elsewhere across the British Empire, in Ireland, for example, in metropole and colony alike. By 1910, minority and its Arabic equivalent aqaliyya had come to refer to non-majority religio-ethnic groups and to imply packages of associated rights, most notably in schools, with regard to language learning and religious education. So between 1910 and 1920, the language of minority saturated the Egyptian press, mostly as a designation for Orthodox Christians known as Copts, and this itself is controversial because who or what is a Copt comes increasingly under question, because the term stops having a kind of strictly theological or confessional sense when the game of numbers is played, and the group has to buttress its numbers by including Coptic Catholics and Coptic Protestants as well. So on his 1910 visit to Egypt, Roosevelt was celebrated as the impartial judge between the minority and the majority. And that very same year, when Boutros-Ghali was assassinated, commentators described the different reactions that the majority and minority populations had. The debate over the rights of Christians as a minority, which reached its apogee in 1911, when 1,000 Christian notables convened at the Coptic Conference to demand an end to the glass ceiling that prevented the appointment of Copts to high government positions. This was the first large-scale articulation of a minority rights program explicitly framed in such a language in the Middle East. Crucially, this was neither sycophantic towards nor accommodating of the occupying British authorities. The call for minority rights didn't seek to undermine national sovereignty, as modern-day scholars would have it, but actually to express an aspiration towards it. Even as this was so, in the thought of nationalist mythographers such as Dawood Barakat, the history of Egypt's early minority rights movement would be completely erased. This is a strange erasure. Barakat was the editor of Al-Ahram at the time when the term minority was being used pretty often on its pages. So his attempt to claim that the term minority hadn't been spoken in Egypt until 3 days before 1921 is a very deliberate one. And that kind of erasure has also guided the insights of scholars today. So for example, Sabah Mahmoud writes, quote, "The term Aqaliyya is not mentioned one in the subsequently published proceedings of the First Coptic Conference," end quote. By my own count, it appears at least 30 times. I don't have the original, because I have an original copy of this, so I have to do it just through Google Books, but you can see some of the examples where Aqaliyya appears in the proceedings. So if the term minority and the question of minority rights was so widely debated in the decade before 1919, why did Barakat and his modern-day heirs like Sabah Mahmoud, Saad Shami, and others find it necessary to deny its long history? By asking and answering that question, we may begin to critically examine the brief history and the meaning of the most ubiquitous symbol of 1919, the cross embracing the crescent, perhaps stifling the crescent, stifling the cross, we don't know. Even those critical of the personnel and the institutions established in the aftermath of the revolution of the so-called liberal age have persistently refused to historicize the symbol and the acts associated with ecumenical Christian-Muslim relations during the revolution, and instead they prefer to treat it as some manifestation of an atavistic Egyptian spirit of convivencia. But the meaning of the ubiquitous cross crescent cannot be understood, I argue, without first making sense of British religious policy in the 1880s to 1919, and also reading the protesters' critique of that policy, especially around minority rights, even as those debates would be deliberately erased by Dawood Barakat, etc. So, the first thing I'm going to do is just offer a quick reinterpretation of what I think is happening in Egypt under British rule with regards to religious policy. It is now commonplace that British state reform, which policed the line between religion and politics in Egypt, represented an act of secularization. For Sabah Mahmoud, Talal Asad, Hussein Abrama, imperial Egypt was not only a secular state on the grounds that colonial officials demanded the separation of religion and politics, but further that the state did so to realize the project of liberal governance. Secular states, they argue, engage in an unprecedented, quote, fashioning of religion as an object of continual management and intervention, such as to make the subjects fit for the presuppositions and ongoing requirements of liberal governance, end quote. Cromer's state in Egypt, however, I don't think attempted to sequester religion into the private domain of the household, if we were to believe what he himself says about his policy. Rather, British officials like Cromer feared that were Islam allowed to recede into the private domain, it would only allow Anglophobic anti-colonial sentiment to marinate. Instead of encouraging the privatization of religion, British officials sought to bring religious practice into the open, visible to all, and therefore make it capable of being monitored. Consequently, Islam began to saturate and spill into public spaces, institutions, and affairs. Far from domesticating Islam, Cromer and other imperial officials encouraged the Islamicization of the state and adopted new religious symbols in public life. So, for example, the adoption of the Islamic New Year is a kind of invented tradition from about 1904 onwards, prohibitions on the sale of alcohol expressed in explicitly religious terms, which was quite new, but also, most importantly, which was to replace all of the appointees within the Ministry of Interior by Muslims. So for the very first time, there is an insistence that Christians are not supposed to serve beyond a certain rank within the Ministry of Interior, on the grounds that such individuals cannot command the ready obedience of their subordinates and of the population. Coptic leaders argued that such policies were sectarian and unprecedented in the pre-colonial Ottoman period. And when they complain about this, they produce vast lists of names of Christians that have served all across the Ottoman Empire in these positions and send them off in these petitions to the British. Cromer's primary objective for Egypt was to transform the Egyptian everyman into a petty capitalist. It was only the impartiality of his unprejudiced British rule which could act as a guarantor of justice, property, and law. The imperial state must be like a machine, Cromer argued, technical, neutral, disinterested, just so it might avoid provoking Muslim rage. Guided by the racist convictions that Muslims were profoundly irreformable and that Islam was defined precisely by its intractability, Cromer abandoned an earlier optimism about the state's capacity to make Egyptians into subjects suited to a project of liberal governance, the sine qua non of modern secularization, according to these theorists. Because Egyptians could conform to the logics of liberal political economy, but not liberal politics, Cromer sought to unleash their pre-existent capacity for capitalistic self-interest, while avoiding any interference in the domains that he understood and his officials understood to be religious. So in 1895, Cromer abolishes the system of local village elections, which were deemed obstructive to the economy. These had been running for at least since the 1860s, and Cromer replaces them with centrally controlled appointment procedures. In doing so, he overturned the novel measure of the secret ballot, which had been introduced by his predecessor, Lord Dufferin, as a way of inculcating new liberal sensibilities of privacy. Yet because Cromer was convinced of the impossibility of making liberal subjects that could vote, he abolished the elections, firm in his belief that the mass of Egypt's populations, and especially its peasants, were, quote, politically speaking, naught but ciphers, too apathetic, too ignorant to give utterance in any political audible form to their opinions, even in the rare moment when they have any, end quote. So, although, for example, these elections, or the abolition of these elections, doesn't really register in the historiography of modern Egypt, what's interesting is that the most outrage it provokes is from the Coptic press. Al-Watan, which was a Coptic newspaper that had been previously very accommodating of the British occupation, turns against it. And explains that before, in the old system of elections, Coptic majority villages could always choose a Omda from their own community, yet the new regulations insisted that the Minister of Interior impose Muslim headmen upon these villages. And it was in that very month, in 1895, that the first claim or allegation of divide and rule appears in the Egyptian press. Cromer dismissed such grumblings as, quote, utter rubbish. Believing Copts to have been contaminated by their proximity with Islam, he goes even further and replaces accountants in the state bureaucracy, traditionally a Coptic profession, with Syrians whose languages and accounting skills he preferred. Cromer's Great Islamic State, which is what one Coptic critic calls it, was a model eluding familiar categories of direct or indirect rule that was emulated globally. His judicious non-interference in the institutions and practices of fanatical Muslims was invoked during the American occupation of the Philippines. General Pershing pointed to Cromer's Cairo as a paragon of how Christian empires ought to stay out of the Muslims' religious affairs. Despite Trump's oft-repeated claim that Pershing's strategy for dealing with Muslim rebels was to line them up and shoot them with bullets covered in pig's blood, Pershing's blueprint for American rule in the Philippines was inspired by exactly the opposite attitude, to limit and ideally eliminate politics, but critically not religion. So this plainly anti-political project of making a great Islamic state created the conditions that gave rise to solidarity within the Coptic community, a unity which by the early 20th century would be quantified, enumerated, represented statistically. Though hysterically described as the waging of a crusading war in Egypt, in the press, the Coptic Conference produced what I think is one of the most systematic critiques of British rule in Egypt, and thereby laid the politico-intellectual foundations for the 1919 revolution a decade later. Coptic political thinkers offered a searing critique of the colonial state, which they described not as secular, they used the term secular in English, but as sectarian, also their own term in English. Their demands for minority rights in the secular state were not the cause of sectarianism, but instead a historically specific consequence of it. The Christian lawyer Mikhail Fanous captured this process best. His thought has seldom been taken seriously by scholars of Egypt, for the fragmentary forms in which he wrote, letters, petitions, speeches, etc., don't really conform to the genres in which we think properly political thought to be located. Petitioning British officials in 1911, Fanous offered a prescient diagnosis of the imperial project. The previous 25 years of occupation had brought nothing short of a Muslim sectarian state, Fanous asserted. Quote, "The attitude of hostility to Coptic claims among Muslims in Egypt is entirely a new creation, dating from about 1895, I assume referring to the elections, and due indirectly to British policy." As his petitions were repeatedly ignored, Fanous asked in what was becoming something of a refrain, quote, "Is there no law in Egypt, or is the Egyptian government more Islamic than that of the Ottoman Caliph?" In the opening session of the Coptic Conference, the notables swore fealty to the Egyptian vice-regent and the Ottoman vicegerent, and raised the Ottoman flag outside the meeting hall, as if to indicate their allegiances. Over several days, the delegates vociferously criticized the occupying British army and emphasized their citizenship rights within the Ottoman Empire. Ironically, the logic of minority representation demanded that a group demonstrate its strength through numbers. This was an almost impossible task in a political context in which genuine elections had been abolished, and in which British officials' favorite line of argument was that those clamoring for rights were unrepresentative, familiar to those of us who know about the 1918 context. Yet politically speaking, they would have to be counted in order to count. Christian proponents of minority representation and their critics played an endless game of numbers, an inexhaustible back and forth over tabulated statistics. So specific forms of denominational identification, Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic, were jettisoned for the larger category of Copt. So many of the people who are at the Coptic Conference are not Coptic Orthodox, but of converts to either Catholicism or Protestantism. And the abandonment of the term Copt, strictly confessional usage, would prove extremely contentious in the responses to this. Saba Mahmoud has argued that, quote, "The ascendant view among Egyptian nationalists was that both the assignation minority and the idea of proportionate representation were colonial ploys." You'll see that that's not true in those demands. Yet at the Coptic Conference, the centerpiece of the proceedings was a speech by Ormus Hanna arguing that minority representation was the secret behind the flourishing of the Roman Empire. Muslim critics of the Coptic Conference warned against the dangers of minority representation. For example, Ahmed Abdel Latif, a lawyer, argued that, quote, "It was not in the interests of Copts to institute proportional representation because the majority will always be in favor of Muslims. In politics, parties can switch positions between majority and minority, whereas in religion, there can be little of a chance of a minority becoming a majority," end quote. Abdel Latif was very careful in his phrasing to avoid any allegations of religious fanaticism, as he attempted to overturn imperial notions that politics were sociologically or religiously determined. Abdel Latif feared that minority representation would amount to the smuggling in of religious categories in place of political ones, and therefore regarded as anathema. The most systematic rebuke to the Coptic Conference comes from Ahmed Lutfi Said and his law partner, Abdelaziz Fahmy, who sits later on the Constituent Assembly, which Jeff shows us a picture of. That's Abdelaziz Fahmy on the left. The little boy on the right is my grandfather and namesake, who was his nephew. The lawyers Ahmed Lutfi Said and Abdelaziz Fahmy jointly delivered a speech that questioned the wisdom of minority representation. Together they raised the objection that minority representation not only reproduced legal difference between two otherwise fraternal communities, but it replaced ideological disagreement in politics with ethno-religious conflict that would be enshrined in law. This, they feared, would make the imperial state the persistent arbiter between the country's communities and thus perpetuate its prolonged position within it. Lutfi Said, as early as 1908, again, evidence that the term qalea was being used much earlier than people would say, had announced his opposition to the division of Egyptians into minorities and majorities. Such a division, he argued, obscured the more important truth. The state was the true minority, to be held compliant by the tyranny of the majority, namely the public. In this way, Lutfi Said subverted the tense language of majority and minority in order to argue for an ecumenical union between Christian and Muslim against the true imperial enemy. However, for Lutfi Said and his colleagues, an emancipatory politics would need to reject the very definitional vision of the British authorities and reconstitute the state upon foundations that did not have religious categories at their heart. It needed an ethical renewal. While this radical vision was indeed seductive for many, for the Copts that were the immediate victims of British sectarian politics, the vision was just utopian. The fact that the categories of minority and majority were socially constructed fictions did not mean that they were not real, since 25 years of policy had been constructed around them. Thus, the debates that kind of open up across that year mirror present-day disagreements between historians over the extent to which sectarianism in the region is itself a cultural construction, and whether that constructedness actually matters at all or not. So, get to 1919. When protesters flooded the streets in March of 1919, many organizers, such as Fakhri Abdel-Noor, standing up there with my great-grandfather, and what was Hanna of the Coptic Conference, became leaders of the uprisings. It's really thanks to them that in the popular and the academic imaginary, the revolution is so strongly associated with interfaith set pieces. A Coptic bishop preaching from the pulpit of Al-Azhar, the iconic Muslim crescent embracing / stifling the cross. As I suggested by the alternative account I've given of the sectarian policies of the British occupation, because it was the realm of the political that had to be controlled and limited, religion, ironically, had become a site of freedom. In 1914-15, the British had passed the Assembly Law, but because they were ever terrified of the fanaticism of their subjects, the British law exempted religious institutions from the restrictions on association to which other spaces were held. And incidentally, this is the very same law that is revived almost verbatim by Sisi in 2013, as Mohammed Zadia and other activists have shown and attempted to challenge in court. So in 1919, it was not only from inside houses of worship that Egyptian activists could print revolutionary pamphlets, such as these, found in a policeman's archive of confiscated material to escape British military censure, but precisely because it was politics that was monitored rather than religion, that priests could preach anti-colonial sermons from Al-Azhar, and the Azhar Revolutionary Party could meet in the Oleli Church in Bolel. So the iconography that emerges out of 1919 is really interesting, because most frequently the cross and the crescent are depicted as though they are the same size, which suggests that there is a persistent refusal to represent Copts and Muslims in numerical terms. So they are different but equal. This white book, which is Zabul Ko, sent around to all diplomats at Versailles is interesting because it shows that both Muslims and Christians were the equal victims of British violence. So if you look at the names, you'll notice that the people on either extremity of the picture have identifiably Coptic names, and the two in the middle have identifiably Muslim names. And this is, again, an attempt to represent these things equally. And finally, this image, which shows Zaghloul and Sinut Hanna, is also striking. It's operating on the same principle. Sinut Hanna was not the most important member of the Weft, but is represented there as an equal counterpart to Zaghloul for exactly the same reasons. So these symbols of sovereignty resoundingly rejected the imperial mission's fundamental premise and promise that it could act as an impartial guarantor and arbiter of relations between Muslims and Copts. The symbols of anti-colonial resistance are unintelligible if we assume that the British colonial state was secularizing, and if we write out the decade-long debate about minority rights that preceded it. Some scholars have been too quick to interpret these symbolic performances as manifestations of a transcendent Egyptian spirit, ignoring the decade-long controversies I've described. They see in 1919 the continuation of an Ottoman subaltern, non-sectarian past that would be interrupted by the introduction of the invasive and foreign discourse of minority. So in arguing this, they are not unlike Dawood Barakat, with whom we began. For Barakat, who also wrote A History of 1919, the ecumenical spirit of the revolution marked the vitality of the Egyptian body politic, robust enough to withstand the intrusion of foreign and imperialist pathogens. Barakat's choice to forget the ubiquity of the language of minority and the rights associated with it was surely no oversight. The revolution had provided him with the evidence he needed that the sectarian strife of the previous decade was epiphenomenal and just the product of an anglicized, westernized elite divorced from the authentic voice of the masses. So 1919 did not resolve the Coptic question, but instead made a taboo of it, foreclosing debates around it then as now, without fully toppling the anti-political ideas and structures that had made these debates necessary in the first place. 1919 deferred a deeper reckoning with the latent contradictions in political representation, which the debates of the previous decade had addressed head-on in some very creative ways. While the Coptic question made the mythology of 1919 possible, the new political vocabulary endowed to the nascent nation-state necessitated that the decade in which it was so fiercely debated be forgotten. Egypt was now a sovereign body, while the minority concept a microbe and mimetic contamination of a European pathology. If Barakat preempted by a century the critique of minority rights that would be revived by Saba Mahmoud and others, revisiting the debates that Barakat silenced and forgot allows us to see how such critiques can be deployed then and now to stifle rather than to promote religious difference. The spirit of Barakat and the post-1919 consensus is alive. When suicide bombers killed dozens of worshippers at Coptic churches on Palm Sunday 2017, supporters of President Sisi denounced minority and human rights activists as agents of a Western power. Not a bacterium this time, but a cancer that sought to spread divisive ideas among an otherwise Edenic, united, multi-faith Egypt. And in 2 seconds, this is the project that Yves mentioned. I'm writing a non-academic book, which may be of interest to people in this room, which is a 500-year history of the Zaghloul family, which is my maternal grandmother's family, dating from 1483, which is where that document comes, which is when they first appear in documentary evidence, and into the 1960s. So these are some pictures from my archive of the letters that they wrote from exile in 1921.
So I'm going to stay in my seat, and I'm going to keep my comments very short in order to be able to allow for a longer conversation. I'm going to limit my comments to a couple of minutes, and when I stop, we'll start taking questions. I'm going to ask you all to follow my example, and if I go on too long, you can start clapping and telling me to shut up, so that we can get a good discussion going, okay? But I really would like everyone, especially if you want to issue a comment, to make your comment, as short as you can. We'll have time for closing remarks later, okay? So very quickly, I just want to say, first of all, it is a complete honor to be on this panel with these two young scholars, and their papers were so interestingly matched. And I'm very happy to see, this a really erudite discussion of minorities in Egypt. But I want to say I came away from listening to both of these papers. Jeffrey had a line in his paper, and you said that religious freedom led to new religious divides, which is very interesting and a powerful thing to say in one short sentence like that. As I was listening to Hussein summarize his talk, I could hear you, tell me if I heard you correctly, you were saying that religious divides led to religious freedom, and then that freedom led to taboo, which is very interesting as well. So this opening up of the speech and then the shutting down of it in terms of the identity of Copts and of Christians, and in both of these papers there actually seem to be very different ideas of who the Christian minorities are, who the Coptic minorities are. There's a differentiation in Hussein's work that was not so, you talked about it a little bit here, it's much more so in the written part, about the difference between Coptic Christians in Egypt and, say, Syrian Christians in Lebanon, or Christians in Lebanon or Syria. The fact that the Coptic Christians were not protected by the capitulations in the way that Syrian or Lebanese Christians were. And so this is very interesting, and then you come to Jeff's paper, where you see the missionaries having a much more holistic identification of who Christians are in Egypt and who that is. And so you have these communities who are being identified so vividly from the outside, working on their own interior identifications. So I have one comment for each of you, one question for each of you. Jeff, my question to you is about the difference between yours and Hussein's paper, and the fact that your missionaries look at Christians very, very differently. And what are the sources that you're using for all of this? So I would be interested in what is going on there. Scientific articulation on race means makes you fascinated of scientific so let's start with the question. Question, right?
Shall I tell you?
And then we'll go there.
Okay. Thank you very much for the erudite presentation. I didn't hear anything about Greeks in Egypt, and which category are they minorities? And second, the Catholic and Orthodox cannot be together. Region by the word called Copts. So all those noise not in the same sentence. And in that case, why much of the Greeks watching the Christian areas. And the other thing is that they didn't hear anything about pre-Arabic Islamic Egypt. Nothing about pharaonic heritage. Copts and most Egyptian Jews and Copts brothers as they side, or are they Arabs versus Pharaonics? That's something that really is baffling. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that basis of explained minorities. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. There's another question right over there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be very short. The comment is that Egypt is a state of law, and I don't think that there are no citizens are being persecuted because of religious beliefs or anything. Dr. Jeffrey mentioned some examples, and I think that I understand that there are there were some incidents in previous histories and mainly during this year of Muslim Brotherhood, but afterwards I think that there are efforts being done to protect freedom of religion. I know, and actually these efforts to support moderate Islam, instead of to stand against extremists. Extremists are trying to terrorize us, because of our beliefs. If I'm a Muslim, a moderate Muslim, or a Christian, we are being, terrorized. I cannot express my opinion freely because of the terrorists, and that's why there are efforts being done to support moderate instead of those extremes. And a very short comment to our friend here.
No, let's stop there. Okay, so we can give other people the chance. Thank you. Any other questions? Right here in front.
First, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. My question is kind of a follow-up on the first question, and this time is regarding the Jewish community of the time. Although only very few Jews left in Egypt today, back in the 1910s and 1920s, this issue was kind of an integral part of this debate. Is it in any way getting into your studies? That's a question. And just a suggestion is that there is that much of writing by local Egyptian Jews at the time, first among them Murad Farag, on the question of the Akkadiyat, which correspond with Omar's wonderful presentation. Thank you.
There's one more question, the gentleman with the iPad.
Thank you for my new name. And I have one comment and question. The comment is about Islamization. So I think, Muslim people dealing with modernity, so they receive capitalism, socialism, secularism. So some movements, especially in the end of 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, try to get ideology based on identity. So Islamism as an ideology, to confront all of this ism coming from the West. And the question is, how we see 1919 in the concept of Muslim people or Egyptian or Copt or Jews dealing with modernity. Not just, because the West for us, it has two faces. One is the example we're going to learn from and, send our children to study there. But in the other side of the coin is the danger. We try to protect ourselves from it. So how can we see 1919 in this concept? Thank you.
I'm going to let the panelists answer these excellent questions, and then we'll have to stop. Okay. All right.
So in response to Eve's question about gents, in the longer paper, I try to suggest that there are quite significant pre-colonial ways of thinking about something that we might call race within the Coptic community. And the reason I do that is, well, first of all, I used to work on kind of papyrology and slave contracts in which slaves were described as being, one phrase is Jilsa Ibti, right? So this is very striking. But also because I have got quite annoyed with the suggestion that any means of communal identification among Copts is just a construct of missionaries, of Protestant missionaries specifically. And actually, yes, we can talk about the constructedness of these identities, and we can talk about the particular modern articulation of a scientistic kind of racial expression, but there is also, the reason these ideas become so plausible in this period is because there is a pre-existing set of ideas about race in which they kind of become embedded. So that's what I'm trying to do with that. It's sort of an attempt to refute the notion that any idea of a kind of Coptic community is itself just derived from, or is in a kind of inauthentic elite phenomenon of Protestantized elites. The question about Arabs, pharaohs, yeah, I mean that's exactly what these people are debating all the time in this moment, and there are lots of different ideas about who is what. I don't find any of them particularly compelling, but nationalists are constantly asking, you know, are we descended from the pharaohs, or are we descended, were we descended from the Arabs, and they come up with all sorts of solutions. In Mikhail Fanous, with whom I was quoting, has a striking passage in which he says, the British don't understand anything about the way race, the intersection of race and class works in Egypt. The reason the Copts are Copts is because they are the people who were wealthy enough, the ancient Egyptians who were wealthy enough to not convert to Islam. And therefore they are both a kind of racial and class elite, and the British don't really understand this about them and have displaced them from their elite social position, and if they are to restore them to that, then order will come back to Egypt. So I mean, there's all sorts of ideas like this floating around in this period, and they're quite fascinating. But there's no one particular position that you can identify with. The Copts who are saying we are all descended, or Muslims and Copts who are descended from the pharaohs. There are Copts who are saying only Copts who are descended from the pharaohs, and the same is true on the Muslim side of the debate. I'll leave the Jewish question to Jeffrey because he's the expert.
In response to Eve's question, I would say that the missionaries, in terms of source material, I'm focused on one missionary collection, the Egypt General Mission, which is a British missionary group. So in the missionary literature, the European groups tended to receive less attention than did the American groups. So this is an underused archive, and I'm particularly interested in the way in which the missionaries in the early 1920s inject the different kinds of discourses into the constitutional debates. The missionaries were not aligned with British officials. They had different objectives. The British had a heavy hand in the process of constructing Egyptian law, and I should say that this process dates back to the 1880s with the establishment of the national courts. 1919 and 1922, although Egypt gained semi-independence, was really the culmination of a long process of legal reform in Egypt. And from a legal standpoint, it was not a break with the colonial past. There was much continuity. The laws, the 1922 Constitution, and the laws that were passed over the course of the 1920s were the product of a long discussion over an extensive period of time. Right? And we can see this in various draft laws that were produced over the course of the years, and the way that these draft laws and published laws echo each other. So the missionaries injected the debates over religious freedom in the Constitution with a political dimension about, conversion. It was really about the ability to convert. This politicized the discussion, and Egyptian parliamentarians reacted by focusing on religious freedom as protection of religion. That's what I'm trying to argue. And that set the trajectory for a certain kind of religious freedom in Egypt that looks a little bit different from religious freedom in other contexts. In terms of the question about Greeks, I would just add to what Hussein mentioned that in some ways, Greeks were considered foreigners, but in the 1920s they were also considered minorities. In some ways, the minority question, which had been a question about Copts and to some extent Jews, was displaced in the 1920s after the story that Hussein tells. The new minorities, so to speak, were these other groups that to many Egyptian nationalists didn't seem to belong in Egypt, right? And the minority question takes on a new form. With the state of laws, Egypt is a state of laws, and the question is to kind of understand the particular character of those laws and how they're being used. And my own intent is not to pick on Egypt in any way, but to say that the story that I'm describing here it's actually a global story that's manifesting in Egypt in a particular way, and it's important for us to understand how a lot of these legal concepts that are deployed today and vastly misunderstood. Isdar al-Din, critics of the Sisi regime have understood it as a kind of medieval holdover. Well, it's not. It dates to the 1980s. It has a very recent genealogy that we can trace, and it's a product of the process of secularization in Egypt. I think that's important for us to understand. And finally, in terms of Jews in Egypt, I think that Murad Farah did write about the sectarian discord in Egypt between 1908 and 1911. But he did so obliquely or discreetly, let's say. He didn't address it directly, and he did not use the term akaleya, to my knowledge, to describe Jews or anyone else. My reading of Farah is that in this time period, he was still working out what kind of society he envisioned for Egypt's future, what kind of society he wanted Egypt to be. I think he was a little bit skeptical of this language, and he saw Egypt still within more moral terms than secular terms. Right? He saw Christian Jews and Copts converging around kind of the intersection of a kind of shared ethical language and shared ethical practices. And in terms of the Copts, right, I think a lot of the minority discourse, the new political vocabulary that was emerging at this time period was still very new, vague, and open to discussion, right? And I think that also applies to jins and race, right? That these are terms that they don't have clear meaning. The meanings have to be worked out. They have to be discussed and debated through time.
I hope you will all join me in thanking our speakers. And I ask the powers behind this conference, are we having a break? 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene here for the next panel.